Welcome, everybody. My name's Angela Harris. I'm Professor Emerita at the University of California, Davis School of Law, King Hall. But I'm coming to you today from Ohlone Land in Berkeley, California, and shout out to the stewards of the land. Welcome to the ClassCrits Racial Capitalism Workshop, which is the 7th in a series of workshops sponsored by ClassCrits, Inc. This academic year in lieu of our annual conference. I have a couple of announcements to make before we get into the presentations. So in the meanwhile, if you like, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat and tell us who you are and where you're from. And welcome to all of you. So we have one more workshop this spring scheduled for April 16th on queering class. And that's going to be a fantastic session. So I invite you to go to the ClassCrits website at classcrits.org to register for that if you haven't already. Another hat that I wear that's relevant to this session is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Political Economy. We're an online peer-reviewed interdisciplinary journal. I will drop our URL into the chat box at some point. And if you haven't already done so, please check us out. Those of you who are interested in today's topic will find some brilliant works by a couple of the speakers on this panel. And we're also always interested in getting your submissions. We take work from students as well as faculty, and we would be glad to have your contribution to the intellectual discussion. And yet another hat that I wear is member of the editorial board of the LPE Project blog. So ClassCrits, the Journal of Law and Political Economy, and the Law and Political Economy blog are all part of the Law and Political Economy ecosystem, as we like to call it, along with the Association for the Promotion of Political Economy and Law, APPEAL, and the many student LPE groups that are popping up around the country. So if you want to know more about law and political economy, each of these organizations is an excellent place to start. Today's discussion will be recorded and archived on the ClassCrits website. If you are interested in coming back to it, or you want to invite your friends who missed it, please do come and check that out. Okay, so a little bit about today's format. We have an incredible lineup of legal scholars today to talk to you about racial capitalism in law. I'm not going to read their bios. Their names are on the ClassCrits description of the event on the website. I invite you to Google them and read their amazing work if you have not done so already. Each of them is going to speak for 10 minutes. I'll keep time, then our commentator will speak for 10 minutes, and after that we will hopefully have time for questions and discussion. Please feel free to use the chat box to post questions as we go, and Denise and I will both try to keep an eye on the chat to keep up with questions. Okay, so before we hear from our presenters, I want to take the moderator's privilege to say a little bit more about racial capitalism and why I think it's an important moment that this term is emerging. So many of you may be familiar with critical race theory. You may be critical race theories folks yourselves. This is a formation that emerged in the early 1990s in the Legal Academy. And one of CRT's important missions has been to draw attention to the pervasiveness of race-making and white supremacy in our legal system, in our politics, and in society more generally. From the beginning of CRT, there have been a few legal scholars who tried to bring this work into the fields that we ordinarily associate with the economy, including bankruptcy, consumer law, and labor and employment law. But nevertheless, within legal scholarship and inside of law schools, we often see an informal division of labor, or maybe segregation is a more pointed but better word, under which race discussions belong in the public law courses and economics is the frame for private law courses, and never the twain shall meet. So in other words, we talk about race in constitutional law and civil rights courses, but we don't talk about it in corporations or tax. Instead, law and economics is the frame through which questions having to do with market institutions get analyzed. So for me, one of the important, part of the significance of racial capitalism is the way in which it tries to disrupt these silos. From the race side, racial capitalism calls our attention back to those who have tried to understand how race plays a role in market and financial institutions and class relations. And from the economic side, racial capitalism calls our attention to how questions of identity and power and processes of extraction, exploitation, and expulsion play a role in those market institutions and class relations. So legal scholars, as you may know, are notorious for stealing key ideas from other disciplines and bringing them into law. And the frame of racial capitalism comes to us from the disciplines of history, Black studies, and cultural studies, among others. So if you don't know the name Cedric Robinson, his book, Black Marxism, is one of the central works in the racial capitalism canon. But within legal scholarship, racial capitalism is pretty new. So what does it mean to look at racial capitalism from a legal perspective? That's what we're here to talk about today. I asked the speakers to address a couple of questions in their brief remarks. First, what does racial capitalism mean to you as a frame? And second, how does the racial capitalism framework apply to your own work? So without further ado, let's have an introduction to the work of these exciting cutting-edge scholars and get a better sense of what this emerging intellectual framework means to the study of law. So I'll just give you a brief rundown right now of the order of speakers. We'll first hear from Professor Athena Matua from the University at Buffalo School of Law. Our second speaker will be Dario Roithmeyer from the University of Southern California School of Law. Third, we'll hear from Andrea Freeman, who's professor of law at the University of Hawaii Richardson School of Law. Fourth, we'll hear from Abby Atkinson, assistant professor of law at UC Berkeley. And then our commentator will be Natsu Taylor Saito. So we will begin with Professor Athena Matua, who's going to talk to us about her work and the racial capitalism frame. So please take it away, Athena.
Okay, I think I've unmuted myself. Okay, thank you. Thank you to the organizers of this panel. And thank you to all of my brilliant co-panelists. So today I am going to be simply talking about the frame and talking about kind of what is a racial capitalism. We're really trying to map what Carmen Gonzalez and I believe are some of its key features. And so Carmen and I are in the process of writing this paper, and it's based on some of the work we've done before. As we see it, racial capitalism is a global racial system of extraction. Its central goal is profit making, and it does this through processes of accumulation and race making. No surprise there. That is, this system is dependent on the looting of society's natural and collectively produced wealth through raced processes of exploitation, expropriation, and their culmination in expulsion of racialized others, including the spaces in which they reside. Race making includes the process of racialization, segregation, and the creation of zones of sacrifice. And let me share my screen with you really quickly. Let me try this. I'm gonna, okay, this is my chart on racial capitalism, which I'm not gonna linger on. I'm just gonna give you these words. Okay, so exploitation. Exploitation involves the commodification of labor and its free exchange on markets for incomes that are at least theoretically sufficient to meet life's basic needs. Expropriation involves the confiscation, theft, and dispossession of human, non-human material and nature's resources, often brutally, without acknowledging or fully valuing the work performed, nor compensating or ensuring the adequate social or natural reproduction of these resources. In other words, any payment is usually insufficient to meet life's basic needs or its reproduction. And it often includes unfree workers and the free or underpaid work of nature, women, and people raised as inferior. Expulsion is the product of both of the processes of exploitation and expropriation, and often acts as a third process of accumulation through the recycling of waste. Race making grounds the different capitalist processes of accumulation. It involves the process, many of you know, of dividing humanity into a social hierarchy of different superior and inferior races as a means of both leveraging profit making through the production of commodities on the one hand or earning super profits on the other. And it's often a process that stabilizes, at least temporarily, capitalist society while also serving as a source of white racial power. Race making, thus, is in part about racialization, but it is not racialization only in terms of a color hierarchy. Rather, this hierarchy can be constructed through various racial markers, including ethnicity, indigenousness, language, culture, religion, among others, depending on the variant colonial histories around the world. For instance, in the colonial history of Ireland, the British constructed their racial superiority over the Irish, not through skin color, the marker of skin color, but rather through a religious marker. Later in the US, immigrant groups, including Latinx and Muslims, have been racialized through religion and ethnicity, so not just about a color hierarchy. Segregation, one of the features, in addition to racialization in this race making idea, is a part of racial capitalism. That is, racial capitalism is born in colonialism. And so segregation plays a major role in it. Segregation is a set of spatial practices or logics and that reinforce and facilitate the different and the efficient operation of racial capitalism's different modes of racialized accumulation. For instance, historically, exploitation of wage labor was reserved primarily for white populations residing in the core countries of Europe, while non white and non European populations, or those otherwise viewed as inferior, were generally subjected to expropriation and expulsion. Today, these practices continue through neo-colonial states and segregated neighborhoods. Also, segregation, and Angela kind of alluded to this, could refer to states of mind and theories about separations and the structured divisions between the economy and the state, or the divisions between law, to the extent they're real, and politics, to the extent they are not real. And it could also be captured in the broader concept of alienation. Finally, this segregated space is all too often converted into what we call sacrifice zones or zones of sacrifice. And in these, occupants are not only expelled from life affirming opportunities, jobs, etc., but they're also subjected to a wide range of structural and physical violence. These include, among others, police brutality, um, experiments like the Tuskegee experiment for the moment, and the slow violence of pollution, dumps in our neighborhoods, etc., problems that are often exacerbated by climate change. Okay, so we think those are kind of some of the essential key features of racial capitalism. Many scholars have talked about this in other fields that they've really expounded and defined racial capitalism. Our work draws primarily on the work of Cedric Robinson, Annabelle Quijano, the environmental historian Jason Moore, and Nancy Fraser. And Kijana is particularly important for me because he theorizes that modern racism and capitalism were born conjoined together out of the same historical transnational processes involving the colonization of the Americas, including genocide, mass land seizure, and slavery on the one hand, and that these two, racial capitalism or white supremacy and capitalism, are structurally linked through the operations of exploitation, expropriation, expulsion based upon a racialized division of a labor, the effects of which are now spread throughout the economy. Okay, Angela, second question, and where am I? 2 minutes? How does your research relate to the racial capitalism project? Was her second question. So I have been working, part of ClassCrits, and I've been working on and off on the issue of the intersection of race and class. So for instance, several years ago, I wrote a foreword for a ClassCrits symposium where I posited that market talk was race talk. And I came up with lots of examples of this. For example, a lot of times when we hear the talk about kind of small government, maybe limited government, right, which has a long history, small government. These phrases may be about many things, but they've also been in part about eliminating the first set of kind of middle class jobs that many Black folks and other people of color had access to. But at the time that I was writing that, I really could not quite figure out the structural links, couldn't articulate those. I think Keanu helps me do that. Then again, several weeks ago, I did a presentation on the competing narratives in the battling executive orders between Trump and Biden around race. And in that battle, of course, critical race theory was demonized and supposedly canceled, but those concerned about that canceling weren't concerned about critical race theory. And I was going to ignore it, but after January 6th, I thought I'd look into it. From a racial capitalism point of view, this debate is situated well within liberalism, but I think one narrative, one about systemic racism, gives you a chance for some movement as opposed to the other narrative around the idea of kind of equal individuals making choices around their preferences, right? Which allows the whole conversation of reverse discrimination to come in. I think the first gives you more room for change. And so my last thought is that ultimately, I think racial capitalism has the potential to move you toward abolition. So if capitalism is structurally racist and racism is structurally organized by capitalist structures or processes of accumulation, then I think it has the potential, there's my clock, it has the potential to move us toward kind of anti-capitalist practice, anti-racist practice, decommodification type arguments, etc. That is toward abolition. So stop there. Thanks.
Wonderful, perfect timing. And that's my timer.
That's your timer.
Our second speaker is Daria Roifmeyer from USC. Take it away.
I'm really happy to be here. I want to jump straight into Angela's first question, which is to talk about what racial capitalism means to me. I think, as many others before me have done, I want to set out 3 central claims that racial capitalism makes that I find key to my work. First, and Cedric Robinson is best known for this, along with Robin Kelley and others, the claim that capitalism's projects take root in a soil already infused with racism. So racialized subjects are actors in capitalist projects. Second, that racism does more than just pervade the soil in which capitalism takes root, but in fact, racial exploitation is key to getting capitalism's projects off the ground. And here I think about the idea that capitalism's practitioners often rely on racial exploitation to bring projects to scale and for cheap. So I'm working on a book called Racism Pays, and this is the idea that racial exploitation actually allows innovators to save money and to go big very quickly. And it does so by giving innovators an access to a large workforce that it can pay much less than their marginal revenue product. And so the examples are quite well known. Sven Beckert's work on the way in which the enslavement of workers launched the cotton economy, and my own work, which I'll talk about in just a minute, where Black and brown workers and their exploitation helped to launch the digital platform industry. The last claim is one that I take a few liberties with, the claim that racial capitalism is vulture capitalism. That is, that in racial capitalism, capital exploits and expropriates from people of color who are already dispossessed, displaced, and disempowered by racism. Vulture capitalism allows capital to prey on those already rendered vulnerable by the country's history of structural and intentional racism. And so with that framework, I want to talk about my work, this book that I mentioned before, in which I look at two case studies of modern racial exploitation. And in particular, I focus on digital platforms involving drivers, so Uber, Lyft, and Instacart, and the emergence of artificial intelligence as an industry. And from these two case studies, I try to develop a theory of modern racial exploitation, keeping in mind that I want to focus on the way in which these processes operate in very specific ways, in very specific times, in very specific places. And then finally, I want to develop a radical approach to workers of color in which workers essentially take over as owners, a framework in which capitalism is used to fight capitalism, fighting capitalism with capital, as a South African friend of mine likes to say. So let me say a word about all of that. In terms of thinking about theorizing modern racial exploitation, I think we can actually define modern racial exploitation in the way that we define exploitation more generally, and that is that employers pay workers less than their marginal revenue product, and in the case of workers of color, far less. And here I focus on current work by Suresh Naidu and others on monopsony power. And he makes the claim that monopsony power is true for most of the labor market. These markets aren't competitive because there are frictions in the labor market and because employers are setting wages as opposed to workers negotiating for them. And I take on that frame, but focus on the way in which people of color in particular have far fewer outside options because of historical and intentional discrimination, which means when you have fewer outside options, you have to accept what employers are offering. And in that second part of the definition of monopsony power, digital platform arrangements make it very easy for employers to set wages. In many instances, because of the platforms, the employers and workers never actually interact with each other. And Adam Reich makes clear that even when they do, 30% of workers don't negotiate at all in general, far fewer when it comes to digital workers. I'm going to share my screen now just to show you a couple of slides that actually help to quantify racial exploitation. So Suresh has just put out a paper that describes monopsony power in terms of how likely people are to quit if their wages drop. And here is a chart that he takes from the Survey of Income Program Participation that explores how likely people are to quit by race. And you can see at the top, the black line indicates whites are significantly more likely than Blacks in the gray dotted line and Latinos in the blue dotted line to quit if their wages drop. An even more stark demonstration of that exploitability difference that comes from racialization is this graph in which we measure how likely you are to stay if your wages drop. Look at the difference between whites on the left and then blacks just next to it, and Latinos after that. There are significant differences in exploitability that you can measure in these ways. And my work explores the way in which those differences in exploitability are attributable to vulnerability from historical and contemporary structural and intentional discrimination. Let me just stop sharing now. So I look at these two case studies as a way of developing these ideas. One having to do with digital platform drivers. Most people don't know that full-time workers are the heart of the Uber and Lyft network. They supply over 50% of the rides, even though they're only 10% of the workforce. Of that full-time group, 70% of them are Black and brown drivers. And experiments with lowering wages with regard to Uber and Lyft show that Black and brown full-time workers will stick around for far longer as wages drop. Likewise, I look at data labelers in the artificial intelligence industry, and in particular, Indian workers who worked on MTurk to launch ImageNet, which was object recognition foundation for the industry. And here too, we see that full-time Indian workers who were paid less than half what workers in the United States were making had dramatically different quit elasticities, to use the technical phrase. The historical work around the emergence of ImageNet makes it clear that artificial intelligence could not have gotten off the ground without these quote unquote ghost workers from India. And in fact, the creator of ImageNet started with her research assistants, mostly white students from Princeton, at $10 an hour, and projected that it would take her 19 years to finish the project. When she discovered Indian workers from MTurk, she finished the project under budget in 2.5 years, demonstrating the way in which workers of color can be used to blitz scale innovations in the digital space. I want to end by thinking about ways to counter this kind of racial exploitation in the digital space. And here I make reference to work being done in South Africa, where the activists and government in South Africa are working hand in hand to rebuild their economy post-pandemic by way of worker empowerment. And as part of their program, they're looking at ways to purchase employer stock by worker trusts and become essentially controlling minority shareholders, with trusts being purposed not just for making money, but also for worker empowerment and worker protection. I borrow from this idea to think about the way in which industries like the digital platform industry or the artificial intelligence industry could be made to issue early employee stock, just the way they do for their programmers, to be put in a trust for the benefit of the gig workers that they employ, so that if those projects take off, the gig workers and the trust that represents them benefit, and maybe more importantly, that those gig workers are able through the trust, along with more permanent workers, to control those corporations and to make sure that they act in ways to protect workers with regard to wages, benefits, and conditions of employment. So I'll stop there.
Great. Again, perfectly on time. Thank you so much. Our third speaker is Professor Andrea Freeman, coming to us from Hawaii. And she, I don't know if you're going to mention it, you have a book out too. You might want to say something about that to the audience.
Okay. Maybe I'll put in the chat. There's going to be a symposium about the book on Friday with 12 incredible speakers. So I'll share that in the chat when I'm done. And I love the comments I've heard so far. You guys are my idols, the people I look up to, and I am so happy to be here today. So Angela, I decided to do a one sentence definition of what does racial capitalism mean to you. And so I came up with the mobilization or exploitation of racism for profit. And then when I started thinking about how does it relate to my research, I realized it relates to all my research because it explains how structural systems that put profits over people rely on racism to sustain them. So this includes a consumer credit system that offers either no credit to people of color, pushing them into fringe lending, or credit with the worst terms and conditions so that corporations and banks can profit when they spiral into debt. It includes depriving Black infants of their enslaved mother's milk to feed white infants. And then when that became impossible, trying to stop Black parents from breastfeeding their babies by steering them toward formula that increases the risk of infant mortality and illness for industry profit. It includes experimenting on Black bodies to gain medical and scientific knowledge that's intended only to help white people and to profit researchers and pharmaceutical companies. It includes forcing meat processing workers who are disproportionately workers of color and undocumented to become infected and die from COVID, just to ensure that the meat industry can continue exporting its product to other countries. And it includes supporting the agricultural industries by disposing of surplus non-nutritious foods through nutrition programs. So what I want to do is talk about this in the context of the food distribution program for Indian reservations, or FDPIR. So I'm going to share a few slides to help me talk about that. Okay, so the USDA promotes the FDPIR like it's this, but it's actually this. And its history goes all the way back to settler colonialism, when the deliberate destruction of food sources was part of the genocide of indigenous peoples. So as part of the Indian assimilation project, President Washington vowed to ruin their crops on the ground and prevent them planting more. Later, President Jackson justified the 1830 Indian Removal Act that authorized the forced dislocation of indigenous nations to the West by the fact that their land could no longer support the indigenous way of life after the damage and destruction that was done by American theft and occupation. After the 1851 Indian Appropriations Act codified the creation of Indian reservations, the Office of Indian Affairs, which was housed under the War Department, took charge of distributing rations to ward off the mass starvation that resulted from its displacement of indigenous people from their homes, land, and food sources. So the US wielded rations as a weapon, withholding them from families who resisted their children's removal to boarding schools or rejected Christianity. The 1862 Dakota War, which was sparked by the deliberate withholding of rations, ended in President Lincoln ordering the execution of 38 Dakota men, which was the largest mass execution in US history. And when the government did provide rations, they were made up of low quality and unfamiliar foods, because the US deliberately left traditional foods out of assistance packages, trying to steer indigenous people toward a so-called civilized lifestyle. Then in 1949, the government began sending commodity surpluses to reservations to support the agricultural industry. FDPIR became an official program in 1977 as an alternative to SNAP because of the obstacles to accessing SNAP benefits posed by reservations isolation. And today, indigenous people have more type 2 diabetes than any other racial or ethnic group. Diabetes often leads to paralysis, amputation, and blindness. Indigenous people's rate of deaths from diabetes is 177% higher than for any other group. Indigenous adults are diagnosed with obesity 60% more often than white adults. And on the Dakota reservation, life expectancy for males is between 40 and 50 years old, as opposed to 76 in the general population, although I guess that just went down a year or two. So indigenous people have experienced higher COVID infection rates and 2 times the number of COVID deaths than white people. Part of this is because of the higher rates of underlying high risk factors of obesity and diabetes that come from CMODs, which is another name for these boxes. So activist Charles Red Gates recounted testimony that he gave to government representatives about these boxes in 1991. He said, "Did you ever see what's in these cans?" This guy said, "No, show us, we want to see." So I grabbed a can of pork and I told him, "You're going to get a bad smell. It doesn't smell good. It doesn't look good when I open it. So you take a look." I got a can of chicken, a can of beef, and a can of pork. The first one I opened, everybody crowded around. I opened it up, and as soon as I opened it up, a couple of them backed away, grabbed their noses and their mouths. When I began to dump it out, they both ran outside and threw up. That's what they were giving us. And I showed them all the connective tissue, the blood vessels. It was some pretty terrible stuff. Because the proteins and the produce in the boxes are often undesirable or inedible, many of the recipients only eat the sugars and the carbs. The contents of the boxes are supposed to reflect the dietary guidelines that are created by the USDA and Health and Human Services. But Bernard and Brown describe these guidelines as, quote, amounting to, perhaps inadvertently, the nutritional equivalent of smallpox-infected blankets. Their gross inadequacy reflects the guidelines' allegiance to the food and agricultural industries. Karuk ceremonial leader Leif Hellman describes nutritional colonialism through FDPIR as, quote, a modern extension of tribal termination and genocide. The USDA defends the poor nutritional quality of the boxes by claiming that they're supplemental, but 1/3 of program participants rely on them for all their food. So CMODs and their effects are so pervasive that for some people, they've become wrapped up in a pan-tribal Indian identity, bridging gaps between indigenous nations because only Indians can have a CMOD bod. Sorry, I'm gonna flip this. Okay. Commodity cheese is something that is beloved across communities. And a quiz titled How to Tell If You're Rezzed Out includes the question, every time you see a line, you jump in thinking that you're getting surplus cheese. Musician Wade Fernandez, who's a member of the Menominee tribe, sings Commodity Cheese Blues. And the song includes the lyrics, I went downtown to the commod shop, met the blues because they were out of stock. Tell me please when I'll get my commod cheese. Visa cheese is a mode of exchange in which a block of commodity cheese can purchase other goods or services. And a 2006 Indian Country Today article observed, some Lakotas still say to this day, the only brick of gold the Lakota people got out of the Black Hills is the brick of cheese rationed out on commodity day. Now, aside from being highly processed, commodity cheese causes discomfort for many Indigenous people who suffer from lactose intolerance and other more serious health conditions linked to dairy consumption. Now, the most controversial commod is fry bread, which is a delicious creation born of the need to convert flour, sugar, and oil into something palatable. To some, fry bread can be a unifying symbol. And I have some pictures here from the movie Smoke Signals, where the main character, Thomas, is trying to be a real Indian by wearing his fry bread power shirt. But fry bread has also become emblematic of bad health and a focal point of outsiders who attribute high rates of diabetes in Indigenous communities to bad choices. So fry bread's famous fan, Keith Secola, contends, fry bread has killed more Indians than the federal government. Cheyenne and Muscogee Indian rights activist Susan Shawn Harjo, who launched a debate with her 2005 New Year's resolution to stop eating fry bread, said, if fry bread were a movie, it would be hardcore porn, no redeeming qualities, zero nutrition. So fry bread's not a traditional food, although it's sometimes treated as one, but it's a symbol of resistance to the disregard to Indigenous health demonstrated by the sad contents of the FDPIR boxes. And the program contributes to nutrition transition, which is a shift from being underweight and experiencing high rates of communicable diseases to being overweight and suffering from nutrition-related diseases. The program is an example of how racial capitalism allows settler colonialism to live on through a government nutrition program that contributes to slow genocide in service of industry profit.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Again, everyone is keeping to their time so beautifully. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Our next speaker is Abby Atkinson from UC Berkeley. Take it away.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in the conversation and just to learn so much from the members of this panel. So I'll jump right in. What does racial capitalism mean to me? For me, settling on a distinct definition of racial capitalism was a challenge and is complicated, but here's my attempt. Racial capitalism involves the creation and reproduction of identity, racial, gender, socioeconomic, and intersectional, in service of justifying and naturalizing a perpetual state of socioeconomic inequality that predictably elevates the interests of those who belong, even as it predictably subordinates the interests of the others, as determined by the social construction and assignment of race, gender, among other designated identities. Also want to borrow another more sophisticated and compelling distillation of Cedric Robinson's innovation, given by Jody Malmed, a professor of English and Africana Studies at Marquette University. And Malmed describes racial capitalism as follows, quote, "Capital can only be capital when it is accumulating, and it can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Capitalists with the means of production, workers without the means of subsistence, creditors, debtors, conquerors of land, made property, the dispossessed and removed. These antinomies of accumulation require loss, disposability, and the unequal differentiation of human value. And racism enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires. Most obviously, it does this by displacing the uneven life chances that are inescapably part of capitalist social relations onto fictions of differing human capacities, historically race," end quote. So let me then move on to how does racial capitalism work involve the work that I'm doing, work together with the work that I'm doing. So I write about credit and debt in the lives of marginalized communities. This is particularly important because financial obligation is central to our economy and to our culture across a variety of dimensions. The law, of course, then shapes the contours of the resulting creditor-debtor relationships, influencing, for example, who borrows from whom, who lends to whom, when that relationship can and should come into existence, under what terms that relationship exists, whether that relationship is voluntary or involuntary, and determining then the relative rights of creditors against debtors and of debtors against creditors. My most recent project, my current project, has been to think about the work that borrowing performs in the broader legal conception of the American public-private welfare state, which is of particular concern for marginalized groups, including those groups constituted by virtue of race or gender assignment, for example. So I focused on how credit debt as social provision reproduces existing social structures and social pathologies, rather than solving for them as the dominant narrative around simple access to borrowing would suggest. My current project surfaces the phenomenon of pension investment in marginalized debt as a source of retirement security by focusing specifically then on the on how public pension funds invest in private equity firms, who in turn target for profit extraction marginalized debt-dependent industries like for-profit colleges, which capture federal educational aid, or small dollar lenders. In this context, credit and debt operate as a means of social provision, not just for marginalized borrowers, but for third parties, and specifically retirement insecure public workers like teachers, state government civil servants, and police officers. Policymakers should be attentive to and wary of this drift toward market-based, debt-funded social provision, because the value of investing in this kind of debt depends on there being a steady pool of marginalized borrowers who consistently and predictably have to pay more in interest rates and fees in order to borrow, whether or not that debt is fairly priced as based on risk of default or else predatory. In this sense, public pension fund investment in marginalized debt, I argue, commodifies the condition of marginalization, which I think is an important aspect of racial capitalism, is the value of marginalization that engenders then, in the particular context of pension fund investment, the quotidian use of debt among socioeconomically insecure communities. It not only capitalizes on the persistence of socioeconomic inequality, but given the identity of the purported beneficiaries in the pension context, namely retirement insecure workers, including workers whose own financial insecurity causes them or may cause them to have to rely on credit debt as borrowers, it may, in a perverse sense, justify the continued inequality and marginalization. And a legal system that operationalizes, that deploys credit and debt in this way, sets up a sort of perverse set of incentives for workers against workers, perhaps in their other identity as just marginalized consumers. So I will stop there, and thanks again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we turn to our commentator, Professor Natsu Taylor Saito.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Angela, and everybody who made this possible. I'm coming to you from Atlanta, where I'm on Muskogee Creek land. And I wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the themes that I saw coming out of these amazing and wonderful presentations. Thank you all so much. And to ask about where this takes us and where you all think that it should take us, because I think that as sort of academics who, are conscious about these social issues, we really want our work to make the world a better place. And as I think about the concepts of racial capitalism, I keep going back to, where are we going with this? What do we want to do with this? And I think what we saw today was this amazing, really brilliant framing by Athena, thank you, which sort of laid out a map, a conceptual map of racial capitalism on a global scale. And I find that work that you're doing, Athena, with Carmen, to be just really inspirational in terms of giving us a framework to put these various pieces in. And then each of the other panelists gave us beautifully detailed examples of how racial capitalism is functioning and the harm that it's doing. And so the questions that come to me are, where are we trying to go with this? And obviously there are many, many different answers, and many answers at different levels. But I'd like to have a little bit of discussion about that. And one of the initial questions I have is, do we all see racism and capitalism as inherently bound together, like inextricable from each other? Or are we hoping that by making capitalism less racist, it will be less exploitative? Is that possible? Or by removing some of the exploitative aspects of capitalism, will that make it less racist? Is that where we're trying to go with this? Or are we trying, sort of related to that, I guess, are we trying to improve the situation of racialized and people who are exploited and particularly vulnerable within capitalism by virtue of having been racialized in one or another of these ways? Are we trying to improve their situation within the current box, essentially? I think that's part of the question that I come up on. And in my thinking, as I sort of ponder the history of this, we've had a lot references, and I know that Athena, in your work with Carmen, you've talked about racial capitalism as being sort of grounded in colonialism and imperialism. And certainly many scholars do that, trace its origins to colonialism and imperialism. Du Bois, among others, does that, right? I mean, it goes way back, this recognition of the origins of the racism and the capitalism as being in systems of colonial and imperial exploitation. And to the extent that we see that as being true, and I don't know that everybody considers that to be really significant, but to me it's very important, I think, in understanding this. And I'm wondering whether you see this as sort of a simple matter of genealogy, like that's where we came from. And to some extent, we still see some extensions of that in the current situation. Or is this a critical dimension of understanding the nature of racism and capitalism, and therefore racial capitalism? Is it something that will actually enable us to figure out how to move forward from it? I've really liked some of the work that's been done by Jody Bird and some other Indigenous scholars, and she talks about how capitalism is not only constitutively racial capitalism, but a way of hierarchically organizing life that's predicated on and operationalized through empire and colonialism. And that they really can't be sort of distinguished from each other, and they can't be relegated to the past, that they have to be recognized as something that's going on now. And she says, well, actually, she with some of her co-editors in an introduction to a 2018 social text volume, which I think is a really interesting piece, says, we ask how the terms of academic and political debate today would be transformed if an understanding of colonization as ongoing and the lived experience of colonialism as a condition of possibility were prioritized and considered as something that critical analysis has an enduring responsibility to address. And what I think they're saying, and at least what I'm saying, is that if colonialism, ongoing contemporary colonialism, as well as the history of colonialism, is what makes racial capitalism possible today, then I think we have to take it really seriously and think about what decolonization means if we want to make racial capitalism impossible tomorrow. So I'd welcome your feedback on those thoughts.
Great. So at this point, any of the panelists who would like to jump in are welcome to do so.
So I think, this is Athena, I'm jumping in. Natsu, that was a mouthful, I think. And so let me just pick at pieces. So I think of racial capitalism as being structurally and intimately joined. I don't think you can pick out one piece or another. All right. I don't think that's possible. I think that they are both kind of horizontally drawn and vertically drawn in terms of systems of domination and horizontally in terms of the way they work. So I think that is the true. I think that I would say that so I think I've argued, and I think Carmen would agree that capitalism has a longer history in the Middle East and Europe, as does race. What really kind of transforms that, I would argue, and I may change my mind on this, that what really changes kind of the um, uh, what what makes them, I guess they were always interrelated, but it really is a particular moment in time that turns racial capitalism into what I think is a global system, right? So it was almost always kind of transnational. It was because it always involved trade and that sort of thing. But the colonization of the Americas, I think really, I think Keanu's right on this, really kind of transformed this into the beginning of a global system that becomes solidified with additional colonization. So we talk about the Americas, but the colonization of India is underway at the same time. And grows in time. So, and then after the industrializations, you have the colonizations, and some of these are before that even, of lots of Africa and Asia as a historical matter. But I also think that's a structural matter, and that does not change. That's very much present today. And that most of the things that we are talking about, segregation, zones of sacrifice, all of that stuff were present at its birth in that moment and remain kind of present. So that would be how I would talk about kind of the structure and a historical telling of kind of how it comes to be. I think in terms of and I think we differ on this, but I think we see racial capitalism as helping us to diagnose some problems that we hope will improve um, current circumstances, right? Allow us to have more revealing conversations, right? So that if we're talking about, if we're stuck kind of in talking about, the individual and being, equal before law and that sort of stuff, you can't get at the structures underneath. You can't get at the context, which is what critical race theory has been saying for what now, 30, 40 years, right? Let's look at the context of this stuff. And so we need those kinds of conversations that allow us, I think, which each of the panelists did, right, to reveal underneath kind of what's going on. But then ultimately, I guess I think that what's important for me for racial capitalists, I think that goes somewhat to your last point, although your last point was a doozy. Um, and that is, I think it has the potential to take us to this idea of saying, and we haven't even talked about gender, right? That race, and critical race theory has also said this, that these things are intersecting and you cannot destroy one and think you're going to be successful. You can't get rid of racism and leave capitalism in place and think you're going to be successful. It's not going to happen. As Charles Mills says, something to the effect of, after we have a transformation or a revolution in capitalism to socialism, you'll still have a bunch of crackers. Right. And I think what you have said, Natsu, and I quote you, that all of this stuff is illegitimate. And so a lot of people for a long time have been saying that these have to be, and that's why the protest was so interesting this summer, there has to be a multitude. We have to be anti-racist, anti-capitalist, which is the piece that's harder for a lot of people, right? So anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchy, that we have to be against those things and talking about kind of moving forward. And I think that racial capitalism may not get you there, but I think of it, and I'm going to be quiet, I think of it in the same way that I think of the 8 to abolition sort of movement in policing, right? So they say, well, defund the police won't get us there, but it is a step toward abolition. In this, unlike providing additional funds to police for training, that takes us in the opposite direction, right? And so I think of racial capitalism as a step in that movement. And I'm not so sure I've been coherent, but there you go.
Can I jump in here? I
Go
just
for
have
it.
two brief points to make. One, I want to push back a little bit, Natsu, on the framing of your question in the spirit of constructive friction, that it's difficult to answer the questions as you pose them because you're creating grand narratives out of capitalism and grand narratives out of at a very high 35,000 feet level about what to do. I think it makes more sense to go project by project to say what is the connection of racism to capitalism's operation in the project, and then what's the way out. And then as to the second part of the question, do we just try to make capitalism less exploitive? So I have an agent for this book, and she, with an eye towards a general audience, says you can't just describe a problem, you have to come up with a solution. And I, resisted, as I usually do. But I'm glad she pushed me, because I connected up with these old comrades in South Africa who are doing this remarkable work, fighting capitalism with capital. But what they're really doing is fighting capitalism with socialism. They're engineering a worker takeover to make workers owners, in control of their conditions of employment, controlling minority shareholders. So the board has to get them on board, otherwise it doesn't happen. And in some sense, restructuring the way that we think of capitalism, at least here in the United States and there as well, with workers as collectively in trusts, the largest potential coalition of investors and controllers. It really does turn capitalism on its head, certainly destabilizing our conventional forms of capitalism. This isn't capitalism as we know it. This looks like public ownership through workers, and there are various other forms of public ownership. And that really ambitious, radical thinking about it in the context of a country in which, race has always been paired with class, has never been about identity or just identity in South Africa, really is an exciting way to rethink literally the way we do business.
I just like to say that I love your comment, and I think that it's such an important point you make about looking at the individual projects, and sort of like Athena was saying, we can look at the individual projects and see, is this taking us in a direction? The litmus test I use is that empowers people, right? Because to me, what is empowering people is liberatory and ultimately decolonizing. But is it taking us in that direction, or is it taking us in the opposite direction? And I think that example that you're giving is a wonderful one of a liberatory move within this framework.
So Danny Hart, your hand is raised. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question directly?
I would. It's not going to be on any of the questions or the framing that Natsu just did, which I thought was really fantastic questions, but it's completely separate. Is that okay to do that now? Okay, so I actually had a question for the panelists, and I will disclose up front that self-interest is prompting me to ask this question. But what made me think about it, so the gist of the question has to do with agency. The gist of my question has to do with agency. And what made me think about it was primarily Daria's talk and Abby's talk. And not because it's not implicated in other places, but I guess I'm just wondering where and how you all think agency fits into the discussion, whether it's critical race theory, racial capitalism, or anything else. And so just really, really quickly, so Daria, when you were talking about AI and the juxtaposition between what's happening with perhaps American workers and then workers in India, the juxtaposition is really stark, and it works, and it really works, and it's very profound. Similarly with Abby, right, the juxtaposition of creditors and debtors, knowing that a lot of the, and I think about the Great Recession where the banks and all of those credit agencies, everything else targeted Black communities and set the terms and so on and so forth. I think that those descriptions work really, really well. But then again, I come back to the question of agency, and what's making me think about it is like Emily Ho and Kristen Kalsum did community action research where they focused on payday loans, and they went into the community, and the community understands how exploitive those payday loans are, but still want and or need the payday loans and don't want them to go away. Similarly, Akhil Gupta and Purnima Mankikar, really, really well-known anthropologists at UCLA, have been doing a longitudinal study of call center workers in Bangalore, India, and show that those call centers are really, really disrupting the caste system in India in new, different, profound, long-lasting ways. And those call center workers that they interview kind of like they like the freedom that they're getting based on the money that they're, anyway, so that's a very long question, but the question really is about agency, because I'm worried about, even in my own writing, how to not victimize the people that I'm trying to champion or the people that I'm talking about. So that's my question for the panel.
Thank you. May I call you Danny? I see that you're Danielle, but
yeah, nobody calls me Danielle, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Danny. So I think, of course, agency is important, but I guess for me, the question becomes agency in what sort of circumstances? So I teach contract law, first-year contract law, which I really love doing, and the legal fiction of contract law as, private entities voluntarily agreeing is that they come some set of equal positioning to each other. And clearly that's not true, whether it's a small chip maker and Apple, or, it's a payday lender and a borrower, right? There's a backdrop in which to think about how voluntary, how much agency power either of those two parties has in entering into the arrangement. And so one story about payday loans, for example, or call center work, or another story that our colleague Vina Dubal pushes against as well, is that it's sort of like in the worst case scenario, give people a choice, right? And give them a choice, right? Let them go out and find and borrow money to take care of their needs, instead of taking a paternalistic route and telling them that you may not borrow because this is bad for you. But I think that situates the issue in the wrong place, right? I think it's important to step back and think about, well, what are the circumstances that, what are the limited set of choices for a marginalized individual in a broader society? And for borrowers, right, if your choices have the lights on or not, or I have family in South Texas who just went through the deep freeze down there. And if it's fix your pipes that exploded because you didn't know you were supposed to empty out pipes before a big freeze, sure, I would like to think that an individual in that circumstance would have the agency to think, well, where do I want to source this capital that I don't have? I want to go to the payday loan. I don't want to walk into Chase Bank, because when I walk into Chase Bank, they're going to look at me funny and think, what am I doing here? Or they're going to tell me no, which is mortifying in that public setting. So I'm just going to go to my corner payday lender. One story is that that's a good thing, but another story is that why do we live in a set of circumstances in which when someone experiences that kind of unexpected emergency, their only option is to go borrow money in service of, helping themselves, but also enriching the lenders and the investors in that lending institution. So I think agency, of course, is important. It just, in the Prop 22 saga here in California, agency was a big part of the gig economy funded push to impose Prop 22, which basically gave like Uber and Lyft a pass from having to treat employees with dignity or even recognize drivers as employees, but agency was a big part of their ad campaign. They had drivers step in and say, I love being able to drive when I want to and drive on the weekends. And it's really good that Uber doesn't have to give me health care because I want to choose to drive on Saturdays. And, you know.
No, but I guess, so that, but that's, I think just kind of makes my point. So my point is, and I wanted, just to make sure everybody, is don't we have to come up with some kind of a theory of agency that will address those kinds of arguments? Because otherwise the people that we're talking about are just kind of the people that we're talking about, and they have no, I don't know. So I guess my question is, don't we have to come up with some kind of a theory of agency that will address those kinds of comments? But I think Dario was going to say something, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to make sure that yeah, I agree with you completely that was all of that's definitely going on. Yeah, for sure.
We also have a queue of some more questions coming in. So so if it's okay, I'd like to call on Tom Clevin next, and then Alicia Jenkins raised her hand too. Tom?
Okay, I've just had a thought as the speakers, all of whom were terrific, were speaking about literature that I read in the past, debating among academics whether slavery was efficient or not from an economic perspective. Some said yes, some said no. And those that are saying no must be also saying that there's something else about racism that's not related directly to capitalism as such. And I just wondered whether the speakers think that that debate is relevant at all to our discussion of racial capitalism today.
I can speak, whoops, I can speak to that. So the new historians of slavery, who include Walter Johnson, Sven Beckert, and others, at some levels reframe that conversation because efficiency always requires consideration of counterfactuals, and there are so many different counterfactuals that one could posit. If you didn't have enslaved workers, would indentured servants from England have done the trick? Or can we imagine another world in which the cotton economy would have launched? I think the new historians have focused on the way in which legal processes and institutions that emerged against the backdrop of slavery were in fact innovations. So K-Sue Park work talks about mortgages. There's a lot of writing on accounting practices. And I think that's a much more useful conversation to think about it less in terms of efficiency, which requires but-for causation thinking, and to think about it more in terms of what actually happened and what role did the enslavement of workers play in the launch of the cotton economy. And I highly recommend those new historians for the answer to that question.
Great. So the next person I have in the queue is Alicia Jenkins, and then after that, Anlin Yang afterwards. Alicia.
It's Alicia.
I'm sorry, Alicia.
Well, speaking into context of what Tom, I like the fact that I came right after Tom because I'm asking a similar question, but it's in regards to today, in regards to racial capitalism. In the context of reparations, can that exist? Like, can you still fight for reparations and in the context of eradicating capitalism? Because when I think of it, I think of like transformative governance, but how can that happen in regards to the fight for reparations? Can it happen before? Should it happen before we end capitalist racism? Can it happen after? And if so, how can it happen after? Like, I know these are a lot of questions, but it's a lot of things I've been thinking about because I fight for reparations for Black Americans who descend from slavery. So it's a tug of war. So yeah.
Great question. Who wants to take that one? What do reparations look like in the context of anti-capitalism?
I'll say something, I don't know if it's helpful, but I feel like some concepts of reparations, like a structural reparations. So say you're looking at the credit card industry and you want to impose reparations responsibility on it for the harm that it's done. It could be big enough to force a restructuring of that entire system while also redistributing resources. So in that way, structural reparations could undermine capitalism in a way that could force us to develop new systems.
And I think I agree with that. I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting idea, because I guess I think that reparations would be a part um, of a negotiated end, right? And that it would be about kind of creating some other kinds of institutions. And some of and reparations could, in fact, right? So this is kind of conventional. I don't know if it's conventional wisdom, but you often hear this in the Black community. Give Black people some health care and everybody will have it in a day, right? That whites are not going to sit there and not have health care if Blacks are have it fully. And so I wonder if thinking about reparations, that if we're not thinking about it being used to institute some real changes. My fear, in fact, is that what will actually happen is that sort of notion of reparations will be made very small, that I guess it was North Carolina, South Carolina just did something and they're calling it reparations, right? That in fact, reparations as a concept to really kind of redistribute wealth will be co-opted. I think we're far more in danger of that. Um, and 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 so I like kind of Andrea's answer, and I also wanted to just respond very quickly to Danny about, do we need a theory of agency? And I wonder if we don't need a theory around these particular projects, and a change of focus. So these young people are brilliant. They're really something. So, and I know there's a lot of academic work behind this, but really something in talking about the police work. And one of the things they have done, because of course, when you go in a lot of the Black and brown communities, of course, especially old women in churches like my mom, they're like, who do I call when it's time to call the police? Right. And yes, we need more police because we have all of these problems here. And one of the things that you might do in terms of, and it doesn't really address your agency, but I think it shifts the question a little bit. One of the things these young people have gone in and started doing in these communities is starting to talk about redefining safety. So what is safety? What does it look like? The police might have a role in that, might not, but that's not our point. What is safety? Right? You see it kind of in the housing context. No, we're not going to talk about affordable housing, because to talk about affordable housing is to talk about the market. Let's just talk about housing. How do we get there? And where's the land? Does the state own some land? Well, let's talk about that, right? So being able to kind of change some of the conversations or refocus them, or simply ask some questions. Because my mom will tell you, well, who am I supposed to call? But asking those questions might be a way, and maybe that's a theory. I don't know if that addresses specifically your question about a theory around agency, but I think it begins to address some of the things that you're concerned about, Danny, would be my response.
Great. I have Anlin Liang next in line, and then Diane Klein. Anlin, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, yes. So I'm also, I don't know if it's a response or if it's a question, but I'm here in the UK, and UK has just ruled that Uber drivers are workers instead of self-employers. And I happened to talk to a Uber driver after this rule come out, and he's from Bangladesh, and he's not pleased with this rule. He wants to be self-employed. He wants to be his own boss. That's what he tells me. And he says, yeah, I know on the paper, yeah, it looks good. You get benefits, you get like a fixed salary or something. Yeah, you get all these things, but Uber doesn't even pay taxes in UK. Will they do that? Will they pay you actually? So that's like I guess my response to this whole agency thing is that I do think like desire, like what do you desire, what do you want, it's like a very important thing to work on. To if you want to organize, for example, if you want to organize workers, if you want to organize Uber drivers, I think that's like if they don't even want to be workers, if they only want to be self-employed, what can you do about, like, how can you change the situation for better? So that's like a comment. I don't know.
So I can address that very briefly by saying three things. One, there is an awful lot of organizing by drivers going on now, both in the US and across the globe. And they ask for a range of things, but they ask to be paid what they're worth. They ask for benefits, and they ask to have control over their working conditions. Two, I think people's response to things like Prop 22 really depends on whether they're part-time drivers or full-time drivers. So part-time drivers have a very different set of interests and incentives that align with people who want freedom and flexibility. The full-time drivers, that 10% on which the system places responsibility for 50% of the drives, want something completely different, and they want overtime, they want retirement, they want healthcare benefits more than anything else. Three, I think that there's a false dichotomy here that makes itself clear in this: do you want work, or do you want you won't get the work if we have to pay you the wages. I think the driver assumes that if he or she is made an employee, that there will be the kind of ordinary coercive and exploitive techniques of managing workers that at some level worker empowerment is designed to shrug off. So the choices really depend on the choice set that you present people with. And of course, Uber and Lyft will always say, well, we'll have to pull out of California if Prop 22 didn't pass. When the truth of that is just a bluff. The kind of profits, well, not profits in Uber and Lyft's case, but the kind of potential payoffs down the line are such that they want to get the project done. They're going to end up being in California. Make no mistake about it.
Great, thank you. I have Diane Klein next in the queue, and then Guy Charles. Diane.
Okay. Just unmuted myself. I can make the little hand go away here. Okay, great. I just had a couple thoughts, sort of questions, sort of thoughts. The first, in relation to the comment about whether the tension between reparations and more significant structural change. I was reminded of this recent work, and I should know who it's coming from because I was looking at it just yesterday, but I don't. The drained pool politics, that is what white people are prepared to deprive themselves of in order to deprive Black people of it too, right? That's why we have the healthcare system we have and a variety of other things. And that's, however, whether we're going to diagnose it as a neurosis, as false consciousness, as identity politics, whatever we're going to call it, if we ignore the fact that there is a willingness on the part of large swaths of the white electorate to make their own lives worse rather than to make the lives of Black and brown people better, we won't overcome it, right? We will continue to read New York Times Magazine articles about why people vote against their interests, right? That is why white people vote against their interests, their apparent interests, when they're clearly not voting against their interests, but understanding their interests in a deeply problematic way for those of us who have a more liberatory politics. The other comment that I wanted to make about the Uber and Lyft drivers, I think it was, I was struck in listening to the comments about how full-time versus part-time people understand their interests, and its counterpart in the gig economy, right? How full-time and part-time faculty members see their interests, and whether full-time and part-time faculty members think of themselves as academic labor that should unionize and all the rest of that, and who wants freedom and who doesn't, and ways in which the legal academy, when it participates in that conversation, often distorts it because so many adjunct professors in law schools are full-time working lawyers, well employed otherwise, when so many part-time adjuncts outside the law school are not in that situation. And so they look similar, but they really aren't similar at all. So not exactly a question. I'm guilty of that. Let me frame my question, my comment, as if it were a question.
Great comments. Okay, we are getting close to our time, but we have time for a couple more questions. I have Guy Charles, and then I have Akila Falami. And Akila, yours will be the last question, but Guy, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for a great set of panel presentations. All right, so my question relates back to something that Daria brought up, and just like some thoughts on it from her and the other panelists would be, how should we think about getting from here to there and the politics of the solution? So not just thinking about the solutions themselves, but the politics that are involved in the solution. So I'm just wondering if people have thoughts on that.
This, of course, is the $64 million question. It's all well and good if you're operating in South Africa, where the former treasurer of the South African Communist Party is in charge of this worker empowerment program, and it was an MP. But how does it happen in the US? I guess I want to say two things. One, there are currents that make it certainly more likely in the wake of the pandemic, as we rebuild the economy, the possibilities seem more open. But at the same time, the $15 an hour minimum wage and increased union rights for workers who want to unionize is going down in flames. So I think you have to think long game, not short game. And because in the short game, we're screwed. But we need to create these longer term visions and then figure out the politics. But you got me. That's why I have a bottle of tequila at the ready when I need.
All right, Akila, last question, and then we'll see if anyone has any final comments.
Oh, goody. Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I can't figure out how to put my camera on. So
yeah, we can
question
hear you.
is, thank you. So my question is, I wonder of the panel, a question about, we've talked about workers and workers joining together to destabilize, Daria, your comment, capitalism, but I wonder any thoughts about, I've tapped into this wonderful community of millennial entrepreneurs and small businesses who are pushing to become millionaires, if you will, and in doing so, have called out big corporations, the 1% who took, got money from the government, the COVID money, and et cetera, and have kind of taken it as a mission to redefine capitalism in a way that's not exploitive. And so the services that they provide are more in terms of empowerment for who their clients are, teaching financial literacy, tapping out of the whole corporate culture of consumption and greed and blah, 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 but empowering, and it's an intersectional millennial type community, empowering themselves in many ways, not as workers, but as the employer of themselves. They provide 401ks, retirement. So I wonder your take on kind of this movement within entrepreneurship to destabilize capitalism.
I'll take a shot at that.
Hi.
I think that insofar as accumulation rests at the very center of what capitalism requires, that, that to me sounds like a kinder, gentler version. But how do we put a cap on the maximum amount of accumulation, or how do we determine what the right mix of values will be between accumulation and then morality? So I think one simple answer for me is that that's good, right? You know, to the extent that you have fairness, justice-minded people going into business, good, but they're taking a PPP loan, right? Which is the government subsidizing a particular kind of progress instead of rejecting the PPP loan and arguing instead that the government should subsidize, you know, pay people's rent instead of giving a forgivable loan to small business holders.
Yeah.
So, you know, in some sense, I think it's still good, but it's harm reductive at its base.
I see.
Wonderful. All right, we are at time, but I want to thank all of you who dialed in. I want to thank our amazing panelists and commentators, and thank you for all of your questions. This was an incredible discussion. And I hope that many of you will come back again next month to hear about queering class. But in the meantime, take good care. Thanks to everybody for participating, and see you in cyberspace.
Thank you all.